The program you are about to see is part of a Cal State Fullerton President's Symposium, where we offered a forum to some of the nation's leading voices on the important and pressing issues impacting and challenging public higher education and our broader communities. We hope you enjoy the program and trust it will provide valuable insights about the important issues, impacts, and challenges facing us today. At Cal State Fullerton, our daily mission is education and knowledge creation. We're committed to being a leader in creating the future of higher education.
So the subtext is, I'm pretty old. That's how I could write that much. Also, when I started, you wouldn't know that here, but in Wisconsin it is so cold, it's hard to do anything but go to your office. So you're not tempted after lunch to take a walk. So you get a lot more work done in that climate. I do want to follow up on what we heard from the previous speakers, and then I'm going to skip some slides, they're in the handout, that are relevant. Particularly, I want to emphasize that most Americans still believe that we live in a society in which a rising tide lifts all boats, meaning that when the economy is growing, the wages and family incomes of the poor, the middle class, and the rich all increase. And again, in Scott's slide, 82% of the population said it was extremely or very important that we grow and expand the economy. That was the case from the end of World War II to 1973. But I think most people still believe that, maybe because we want to believe that. During that remarkable golden age, inflation-adjusted annual earnings increased rapidly across the income distribution for both workers with a high school degree or less and workers with a college degree or more. In fact, when I started as a postdoctoral fellow at the Poverty Center in Madison in the mid to late 1970s, we had a conference asking why, if poverty has been falling so much, has inequality been falling so little? So in this great post-World War II boom, and I'll show you a little later, poverty was declining rapidly and inequality was declining a little, and that was a golden age. Since 1973, and what's happened in 1973, the first oil embargo, which certainly, if you live in Michigan, know that it challenged the American automobile industry. We weren't driving a lot of foreign cars in 1973, as we are 40 years later. Since 1973, a male worker with no more than a high school degree and adjusted for inflation earns less learns less today than then. So, as was mentioned, we live in an era of growing inequality, an era in which low unemployment rates are necessary. We're not going to reduce poverty and inequality in the Great Recession or in the slow recovery from the Great Recession. But the only time in the last 40 years that we had anything that looked like a rising tide lifts all boats was about 5 years in the 1990s, when unemployment was so low there was a labor shortage. So unemployment was 4% in 1999, 2000. Harry Holzer, who did surveys of employers, went back to some employers and they said, oh no, we don't hire high school graduates, high school dropouts, except right now the labor market is so tight we can't get anybody else. And so I think the world, when they say economic growth is the most important, somehow thinks we live in a world in which the unemployment rate is 4%. And it hasn't been for many years since 1973. Why? And the first presentation touched on that, and I'll just mention it here in one of my slides. For the last 35 years in the US and in other OECD countries, labor-saving technological changes the globalization of labor and product markets have transformed economic activity. I think it's Richard Freeman in a wonderful book called America Works says something like the typical less skilled worker in the US suddenly had 2 billion competitors in the world market. But as I like to tell my students, it's not just corporations moving jobs overseas, it's all of us who are destroying middle-class jobs. I'll give you an example. At the University of Michigan, in the pre-computer age until very recently, I would show up to class the day after Labor Day and hand people a reading list and say, go buy these books at the local bookstore. And the local bookstore made something like 50 or 60% of its profits on the first day of the fall term or the first week of the fall term and the first week of the winter term. Now, we are encouraged to send an email to our students who register in advance, telling them that what books we are going to use in June so that they can buy them on the net at the cheapest price. So our students benefit, they get books at lower prices, and guess what? The local bookstore is bankrupt and is no longer there. So it's not just corporations, and one can think about a lot of jobs like that. What's different, and again it was mentioned, is that in the US, government policies have not offset the rise in inequality to the extent that's been done in the other countries. So this takes us up to before the Great Recession. We had been in this era of rising inequality. The Congressional Budget Office study takes us to 2007, and now we get this Great Recession, which is very severe and which in some ways has set back any hopes for poverty reduction by at least 10 years. I'm going to argue that the economic stimulus was terrific. Most of you who read the paper will think of that the name is the failed stimulus, but I'm actually going to argue that the stimulus was terrific. It included exactly the policies that one would need if one was serious about helping the poor and the unemployed. And in 2009, I gave a talk saying this was the best of times, this was the worst of times. It was the worst of times because unemployment was around 10%. It was the best of times because there were all these pieces in the stimulus related to food stamps, unemployment insurance, the earned income tax credit, which, if made permanent, would set the stage for poverty to fall further during the recovery. I don't need to tell you that Congress is not likely to make permanent any of the extensions from the stimulus. In fact, most of them have expired or will expire at the end of this year. Unfortunately, we're in a period where we seem to be relying on economic growth as the primary anti-poverty strategy. I'll read you a quote. You can guess who it's from. We cannot and need not wait for the gradual growth of the economy to lift the forgotten fifth of our nation above the poverty line. Today, as in the past, higher employment and speedier economic growth are the cornerstones of a concerted act on poverty. But general prosperity and growth leave untouched many of the roots of human poverty. In other words, this quote from a president says that economic growth on its own is not enough, and that's my message today. That was Lyndon Johnson declaring war on poverty in 1964. So let me run through, I guess I've pushed the buttons already. I've mentioned this, you have that. We heard a little bit about why poverty and inequality are higher in the US than Europe. Americans are more likely to believe that anyone who works hard can get ahead. The numbers were in the presentation. Americans are less likely to endorse government's responsibility to reduce income differences. We heard about that. And Americans prefer a flexible labor market with relatively little government regulation of firms. And again, I like to tell my students the best example of that is people watch Donald Trump and enjoy seeing him fire people. In Europe, it's a lot harder to fire people. I won't talk about the numbers, but this is a quick Rorschach's test. In the great boom, 47 to 75, when a rising tide lifted all boats, all of those numbers are around 90%. The smallest bar is at the top. That means everybody's income was roughly doubling. And the smallest number is, I guess, the light blue bar on the right. This is the same from 1975, 2010, a lovely stepladder. It means that the lower you started, the less was the income gains. This is the slide I use when people say, the problem is the poor don't want to work. Anyone who works hard in America can get ahead, and we saw that again in Scott's presentation. Well, this has nothing to do with the unemployed. These are people who work full-time, full year. This has nothing to do with welfare. People who work full-time, full year don't get welfare. They don't get unemployment insurance. Unless they're past retirement age, they don't get Social Security. And this is everybody, including college graduates, professors, et cetera. If you had told me when I started working in this field in the 70s, what would median earnings of men be 30 years later, I would have taken the slope of the blue line. I learned a little bit of econometrics at MIT. And I would have projected this 34,000 through 48,000 to something that would be like 90,000 today. And indeed, serious scholars, James Tobin of Yale, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, predicted that poverty as we officially measure it with the existing measure would be zero by 1980 or the mid-80s. Well, it's just flat. So to me, this is the best indication that a rising tide no longer lifts all boats. Now, I have friends, Larry Mead, who says if your wages aren't going up, you can get a second job. Lots of people used to work second jobs, and I guess that's true. To the extent there's good news, and Sue, who's going to talk about education, has even better news about educational attainment, but the red line for women shows at least continued growth. Women earn less than men, but the slope is at least upwards. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to just show the poverty. So in this great post-World War II boom, whether it's for all persons or adults, poverty fell dramatically from 59 to 73. We've never reached those levels. Poverty hit 15% in 83 and 93 recessions. Poverty's about the same level today. I have a slide earlier. Poverty is going to go up in September, and it will be a campaign issue. It will go up because 2011 is not a very good year. The unemployment rate, while falling, it was still average close to 9% in 2011. Indeed, it's just 8% today. So people are going to say that's an example of the failed stimulus. We spent all this money and poverty is high. I'm going to say, and it's very difficult, you can do this in class, what's the counterfactual? Actually, poverty would be a lot higher if we hadn't had the stimulus, but that's hard to convey in a soundbite. I've started talking about the Great Recession. This is what's really depressing, if I haven't depressed you yet. This basically shows you the extent of job loss. So the last really deep recession was 1981. We lost about 3% of jobs in about a 2-year period, but we quickly gained them back. So by roughly 30 months, 2.5 years after the end of the recession, we had gained back. The 2001 recession was very shallow. We lost about 1.5% of jobs, but there was a very slow economic recovery. So obviously, even before the Great Recession, people were talking about the aughts as a lost decade. But it took 48 months after the start of the recession to get back. Well, we have the worst of both worlds in the Great Recession. One of the reasons we have the worst of both worlds is because the stimulus expired. And what is that? In the last year, state governments, I don't have to tell people in California this, they are poverty unemployment generators. State governments have offset about a third of private sector jobs. So it's something like the private sector is in recovery, the state sector is killing jobs, and what was a big part of the stimulus? Paying for states not to lay off teachers and other state and local workers. So what we have is an example that, what I call deficit mania, the need to balance budgets, which state and local governments have, we know what austerity does. So to balance the federal budget during this time is to do what California and the other states are doing, destroying jobs. I'll read you a quote, because it's always better to quote other people to make you believe it. This is from Brookings, the Hamilton Project. If the economy adds 208,000 jobs per month, which was the average monthly rate for the best 10 years of job creations in the 2000s, then it will take until November 2023 to close the jobs gap. In other words, we won't get back to 100% till November 2023. Let's be optimistic. Given a more optimistic rate of 321,000 jobs per month, which was the average monthly rate for the best year of job creation in the 90s, so those were the good old days, the economy will reach pre-recession employment levels by January 2017. So if you want to be optimistic, things get better in 2017. If you want to be pessimistic, it's 2023. Again, I'll skip over. I've mentioned this. I think the stimulus was greatly successful. It kept the recession from being much more severe and poverty from being higher. It was poorly explained by the administration. It's been misreported by the media, and it's become a political failure that has fed this deficit mania, which shows up yesterday in the House passing a bill to really smash what good food stamps and school lunches and programs like that have done during the recession. I've mentioned these. These were the kinds of spending on the poor and the unemployed that made me optimistic in 2009. I was particularly a fan of the TANF Emergency Jobs Fund because I believe, based on looking more carefully at the labor market, I haven't been able to do that in my short time today, that there are many people who are going to find it very difficult to get jobs even when the unemployment rate is low because of this continuous labor-saving technological change. The expanded earned income tax credit is very important because private sector workers, even when they get called back to work, are not going to get many wage increases. And obviously, in an education group, I don't need to talk about the importance of Pell Grants and Head Start and early Head Start. Again, economists on both the right and the left believe that the stimulus worked. I actually have a better quote from Robert Hall, who's at Stanford and the Hoover Institution, in which he actually sounds a little bit like Krugman in saying that the stimulus was not big enough. Obviously, Krugman and Stiglitz went out on a limb and said it wasn't big enough, and I think most economists believe they're right. This is in this Daedalus article, so you can look it up. The combination of increased federal purchases and benefits raised output and income by 2%. Had the two elements not been in place, the shortfall of its GDP from its trend path would have been much greater. Stimulus worked in the sense that the recession would have been substantially worse without the stimulus considered here. But the stimulus moved the economy only a little bit of the way toward its normal growth path. It left an economy badly injured by the recession. I think I've said this. Those are the poverty numbers. Current economic climate, as I mentioned, unemployment is falling, but it remains high for several years. 2017 is, I guess, several years. Wage growth for less educated workers is unlikely. They haven't had it over the last 40 years. There's no reason to expect it will coming soon. I think I've mentioned all of this. Income and wealth inequalities are at their highest levels. Isn't this a happy story? States are cutting social programs and public sector jobs, and deficit mania threatens safety net programs. This is a forecast by Isabel Sawhill from Brookings. The optimistic forecast is if with everything in place, that is without any further budget cuts, she's projecting poverty in 2016 to be 14.5%. So no progress really at all over, you can go back to 1980, virtually ups and downs, but nothing like this big decline when we did have a rising tide lifts all boats and aggressive policies. So what would I do? I would make permanent the stimuluses, food stamps and unemployment insurance changes. I would establish a subsidized job program for the long-term unemployed. I'd expand the EITC. I'd let the Bush tax cuts expire. You can see I'm not running for office. And then, because I know there are people who will say, oh, but to pay for this will destroy the efficiency of the economy, blah, blah, blah. The simple point I would make is the kinds of tax increases most people are talking about are the kinds of tax increases that were in the Clinton tax increase of 1993, and we obviously had a very robust boom. Certainly taxing the rich, 75%, I guess, as the French proposed, is not a good idea, but raising the marginal tax rate a few percentage points and getting rid of tax loopholes is, I don't think, a very serious problem. Serious research has been done on this by literally hundreds of researchers. There are negative effects on work and family and savings of higher safety net programs, but they're relatively modest. I think one has to worry more about the work disincentive effects of generous unemployment programs if the benefits are as generous as they are in Europe, and if unemployment is 4%, with the unemployment rate at 8%, and our rather modest unemployment insurance benefits, but massively increased by the stimulus, there's a lot less shirking and people refusing available jobs than one would think. So thank you very much.
I was actually going to ask a question to Professor Spitzer.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well,
I have questions for you too, but then I don't want to hog the time. So, so Professor Spitzer, I read that a lot of independent voters aren't actually all that independent. So, like, a lot of people will self-identify as independent, but then their actual voting patterns are pretty partisan. So when I saw like the breakdown that you made by party party identification, like I was kind of wondering if you had any data on like the actual voting patterns of these so-called independent voters.
No, I don't. I don't have any data on the voting patterns in Orange County by that. Some of my colleagues in my department might have more of that. But I can tell you this, that you're right. When we look at it nationally, that voters who say that they're independent, we then ask, in a typical survey, we'll ask them, would you say you're leaning Republican or leaning Democrat? And then studies have shown that those who are leaners, but who are registered independently or don't have a party registration, tend to be pretty consistent in their voting. So you're absolutely right. In this case, what I've seen in terms of the numbers is that the independent voters on the issues of inequality and the things that I've looked at shift around in different directions. Then it's unpredictable, at least eyeballing the data so far.
Another question? Okay.
I just read an article in the New York Times today that the Congress passed in the House what amounts to an austerity budget in terms of doing away with Medicaid and food stamps and things like that. One of the things that they said was that if you subsidize student loans, that actually it contributes to institutions actually raising tuition. And I just wonder, how do they make that connection with regards to that statement?
So I'm going to pass the mic to Sue Donarski unless it's in her talk.
It's not my talk, but there actually isn't any. That's a hypothesis. There isn't evidence on that. So that's something I thought might be working, but many researchers have tried to find whether that connection exists, and they have not found such a connection. Don't believe everything you read in New York.
Steve?
Thanks for great presentations, all three. Most of the data that you presented this morning has been on income, and my question is about wealth, because I think the key or the core of this recession has been a decline in wealth, related obviously to the decline in the value of household assets. And given the predictions on the prospects for reducing poverty over the next 10 to 15 years, that to me is concerning, particularly when you add the fact that, from what I understand, a good chunk of the recovery so far has been a jobless recovery that has been rested largely on increased worker productivity. And so I wonder if any or all of you could comment on that.
Sure. Wealth is distributed more unequally than income. One of the things that obviously happened is that there was a sharp reduction in the wealth of the rich when the stock market crashed. So certainly all the professors I know were making jokes about 201Ks when the Dow was 6,500. But the difference is they were still employed, and they could stay employed. And so people would say, well, I lost 3 years worth of salary. I'll just work another 3 years. Too bad for the young assistant professors trying to come online. But so they had a response. Other people, and we're doing a survey in Michigan, so this is an anecdote, but I actually speak from a survey we've done about the recession. Other people got laid off, and to stay in their homes, they told us things like, well, the good news was I could draw down my retirement account. The good news I could draw down, I had been saving money to send my kids to college. Okay, so that group of people hit with unemployment drew down their assets. Now what's happened? Well, the stock market is mostly back. I now am willing to open up my TIAA, whatever they send me quarterly. For a while, I didn't want to open it. Why make yourself sick? But now it's mostly back. I open it and I look at it and put it in the file. And so, But theirs isn't back because they spent it. So I think their long-term effects of this recession going forward, with implications for rising inequality. The people who had high wealth have recovered a lot more, in part because a house is a relatively small part of the portfolio. Obviously, in California, many middle-class people would have most of their assets in the house, and the housing market has been. So then this ties you into deficit mania and the need to cut back Medicare and Social Security, which there is in the long run. I think everybody agrees they're unsustainable. It's when do you go after these in the middle of a severe recession and slow recovery, or in the long run. There are different ways to slow the growth of Social Security. One of them involves across-the-board cuts in Social Security. The other involves increasing the base for Social Security to bring in more revenue from high earners, and taxing more of Social Security. Part of Social Security is taxed in the income tax for high earners, but one could tax more of it. The same thing in Medicare. You can have across-the-board cuts, or you could have income-tested premiums by which the monthly premiums for Medicare. I think that the point is that we've had rising income and wealth inequality for a long time. I think what we're likely to see, given the recovery we have, and in Kirsten's first slides from Piketty and Saez, as we get out to 11 and 12, I think we'll see that there's been a lot of recovery of the wealth and income of the highest income folks.
It is working. I have a question, so I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. You talk about the level of poverty, and it's going up, but I think from those who would probably disagree with you, and I'm not one of those, they would argue perhaps that the level of poverty is, while it's higher, all right, they can still subside, they can get by on that. And on top of that, I'm not sure your measure of is including the transfer payments. So if transfer payments are there, well then what's the big issue? We're always going to have some poor people. We can't do that much about it, so why worry about it?
I think that's a good lead-in to Sue's talk, because one of the things she will show is that the children of the poor, yes, the poor today are better off than they were before the war on poverty, when there was no Medicaid, no food stamps, no school lunch, no state child health insurance program, no Head Start, no Pell Grants. They're better off because of that safety net. But Sue will show you, and I hate to steal her thunder, but I've seen her slides, that the children of the poor are dramatically less likely to be able to move up. So if we do believe we live in a world in which there's a lot of mobility, I think we need to do a lot more to increase the mobility of those from the bottom.
We have another question here.
Given the growing increase in the difference in income and wealth between the top 1 or 2% of the population and just about everybody else, and the real erosion of the middle class over the past 30 years, I wonder what our speakers, whether they have any thoughts about whether this will eventually lead to political instability in the country.
Defer to the political scientists. I know that Tom Edsall and Marty Gillens have things to say about that, but maybe Scott, because he has surveyed your fellow Orange County residents?
Here you go.
Thanks. So one of the things that we're seeing in the slides that I was in the survey is that as people are thinking about this inequality, you know, it's less, folks are still not all that sensitive to inequality versus job creation and those kinds of things. However, when you start to ask them questions about their life chances, right? Can someone, it's a very crude indicator, you know, what percentage of the public is willing to say, yes, we can start out poor and be rich? if we were to able to look at that in a much more fine-tuned way, my hypothesis is that as people get more and more aware of the way that mobility is constrained and how difficult it is to do that, folks will become more and more upset at this inequality gap. That can lead to a lot of changes politically, but right now, there are so many ways that this is filtered through the political process, and it makes it much more complicated. So that's.
Next. Go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to ask the speakers if people are really out there looking at the effects of when we try to reduce unemployment and looking at increasing employment, if anybody's really looking at the whole aspect of underemployment. People who have lost jobs and now they, are having to take any jobs just to support their family, whether they're, have a college degree, they're having to go ahead and take lesser paying jobs to support their family. In essence, that's really something that really needs to be addressed because if you just look at increasing employment, you really need to see how are these people, are they able to go back to their trained professions, or are they taking a lot less paying jobs out there? So the underemployment issue.
So you want me to tell an even more depressing story than I told? That's
really
true. That's true. So in the data I showed, if you were a computer programmer at a firm in Fullerton and you were laid off and your unemployment insurance ran out and you took a job selling computers at Best Buy, this would show that the employment rate had ticked up, and you're arguing, but that person is a lot worse off. There is, again, very serious research on the scarring effects of recession. An economist at Columbia, Till von Wachter, and a number of researchers have shown there are scarring effects, and in particular, there are scarring effects on young college graduates. It's better to have graduated college in 1999 than it was in 2009. So those are very real effects. That's part of the inequality story. I'm focused on those at the very bottom, but Kirsten's slide showed you that there was a large decline in the share of income going to the middle 60%. So what you say is certainly right on target.
Could any of the speakers address what I understand is the next mortgage crisis, which is the student loan crisis?
Can you stick around for another half hour?
Sue is an expert on all things higher education.
So the next talk.
So I have another question. Given all this depressing,
I should go to work for a drug company and sell antidepressants.
why don't you just retire to the Florida Keys? And what keeps you going? I mean, what's the drive for you?
Well, I'm first and foremost an academic, and I have not and will not accept the nomination for any office. So I enjoy teaching students, undergraduates, masters, and doctor students, and I enjoy doing research, even though no one listens.
Next question.
Hi, this question is more towards the, if you don't mind, the theory behind your conclusion. I must confess, I'm in the philosophy department, so I'm a little bit more interested in the theory. But my undergraduate was in economics, so I understand the numbers that you're working with. But I'm really glad to hear that you are coming out to argue that that the stimulus package was successful. I wish that that was more widely known. And that position is actually distinctly against the trickle-down economics of neoclassical economic theory. So I'm wondering, are you advocating some sort of Keynesian economic policies, or when you want these stimulus policies to be more permanent, could you share with us a little bit more of your thinking behind that? Or did you just draw the conclusions because of the numbers in the end, in terms of outcome? Thank you.
Okay, good question. No, what I would say is that for about a decade, poverty researchers were working in all of these areas. So there were people working saying, we need to modernize our unemployment insurance system. There were scholars studying the earned income tax credit. There were scholars studying the effects of Head Start and early childhood education. And it would be interesting to know, I mean, this is where serious scholars will need to do the archives. I think what happened is while the stimulus bill was being put together very quickly, you know, it passed in February, a month after Obama was inaugurated, that the administration relied on a lot of experts and said, if we're going to do something about unemployment insurance, what do we do? And so people actually took pretty good policies off the shelf and put them in the stimulus. And so my saying we needed something like the TANF Emergency Jobs Program was based on my having studied the welfare to work experience in 1996, for which a lot of research was done, which showed that, yes, a lot of women could move from welfare to work, and welfare reform increased the well-being of women and their children when they could get jobs, and that meant when the unemployment rate was 4 and 5%, and they're not likely the people who are going to get hired when they're 8 and 9%. And so therefore, if you're not going to give cash welfare, which we don't anymore, you need to have this jobs program. So I think each one of the pieces of the stimulus that's highlighted in my slides are based on a serious set of research studies in each of the areas. And so my saying that they needed to be made permanent, I would have been advocating for those policies independent of the stimulus, but I was so giddy, it's hard to imagine me as optimistic, right? In the spring and summer of 2009, because these policies were there. The other thing about it, it was, you know, the administration did draw on the best and the brightest. Not that it did much good, but so lots of people who really were experts in the area. Sue's going to talk about education. C.C. Rouse, Marty Gillen's colleague from Princeton, was the person on the Council of Economic Advisors to deal with education policy, and she had spent her whole career doing research on increasing educational attainment.
We have time for one more question, so Phil.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Thank you all first very much for those presentations. The OECD numbers that I think Kristen showed leads to two questions. One is, what does that say about the American exceptionalist argument that people like Sarah Palin, for example, have made? And secondly, how would you account for the cross-national findings if you put the U.S. in that context? And it was increasing inequality in the OECD countries as well as the U.S.
Some of the technological changes and you know, globalization, labor-saving technological changes are going on everywhere. And those are affecting workers in all advanced economies. Even the South Koreans, who are relatively new in producing autos, are petrified that they're going to be wiped out by the Chinese auto industry over the next 2 decades. So these changes affect everybody. I think, as Kristen said, most other countries have more progressive tax systems and more transfers for the low income. I guess since UK was pointed out, there's a wonderful book on Britain by Jane Waldfogel called Britain's War on Poverty. And again, it's an example, I think, that goes back to the back question. Tony Blair declared war on child poverty in Britain in 1999 and put in place a lot of US-style programs. So again, for people who say what we know, Ronald Reagan, we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. There's this perception that our programs are counterproductive. Blair actually put these programs into place. And it strikes me as an example of American exceptionalism. We've had Head Start for 50 years. It's one of the first things that President Johnson did in the summer of '64. Still only about half of all poor kids have access to Head Start. Tony Blair implemented a program called Sure Start. Sure sounds like Head Start to me. And within 5 years, it was 100% implemented across the country. So we're exceptional in that we don't like to spend money. And even when the economy is booming, you know, we did have a surplus before the Bush tax cuts. And so when Blair had a surplus, he used a lot of it, and Waldfogel's book shows to great effect in reducing child poverty in the UK.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Danziger. We do now have time for a break. We're on time right now.